ask that now you would quiet our hearts and help us to focus on you and focus on what you would have us to learn, what will be shared with us today. We pray that we may have the insight and wisdom we need through your Spirit. And may this strengthen us in our service to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Thank you. Thank you. Good. Well, this is the final book in the series, Theology and Science at the Frontiers of Knowledge, Grounds for Belief. It is the longest book of the 12, coming in at 361. The next closest of them was the second volume at 284 pages. So it's quite a thick book, and probably the most comprehensive of all of the books. The nature of what it is that he's attempting to do is he's really trying to do what Torrance is doing, showing all the reasons why what people think about science are wrong and all the things that are gained when the science and theology conversation is brought together. So I did not read every word because it was taking me so long, but I need to read it a bit more and understand what it is that is all implied in this book, because it does have a lot that really corresponds a lot with T.F. Torrance. Russell Stannard, who wrote this, died in 2022 at 90 years old, so he was alive until really quite recently, which is quite interesting. You kind of think of some of these people as having been gone for some time, but not the case in this particular instance. The book itself is one of, I think it's probably one of my favorites, though it's not without its challenges, just because it's so thorough in its scientific discussion. There are points, I don't know if you ever read scientific pieces where you go, how does somebody have this many branches of knowledge in so many fields of science to bring to the conversation? But every chapter pretty much has a summary in it. Plus, he did this summary at the end of the book, which he actually says in the opening part, if you want to see if you want to read the book, read the last chapter, because I've summarized the whole book there. That's what I posted for your reading. So did anybody get a chance to read that chapter 21? You did, Bill? Not Howard. What about you, Matthew? And what about you, Todd? Todd's shaking his head no. Okay. That's my X-ray eyes going on there. When we began this series, I read an article by Jim Neinhardt. Let's see if I can get it so you can see it. Critics Corner, Theology and Science at the Frontier. So this was written at the end of when the last of the books came out. And this book has more references to it than any of the other books in the series. He specifically makes mention at one point, as Russell Stannard suggests, both epistemological dilemmas are a consequence of human language being pressed into its very limits. Two essential aspects of the phenomenon commonly are to be understood in mutually exclusive contexts. He's talking about theology and science, and yet both aspects are required to provide comprehensive knowledge of the phenomenon. So he's attempting with both science and theology to say, when you're in a conversation using the language and the studies of both science and theology, one has the greatest ability to talk about all that is present in what we would call reality. So this book is profoundly comprehensive at that level in terms of what it's attempting to do. The nutshell that I wrote there, this book explores frameworks of thought. And again, to say the phrase frameworks of thought, which there are three frameworks that he particularly deals with: the physical, the mental, which he uses the word consciousness quite a bit with that, and the spiritual framework. He talks about his interpretive ways that we come to the world and how often they get separated. And so his work, in a sense, in this book is an integrated understanding of how we understand frameworks of thought, and that these frameworks really shouldn't be separated from one another. And when you do, you lose something that is too much to be lost. So the way that we think theologically and scientifically within a single reality as personal beings. So he would say science should have a physical aspect, a mental aspect, and a spiritual aspect. And theology should have a physical aspect, a spiritual aspect, and physical, mental, and spiritual, all three of those as well. So both of them have this overlapping sense and working with frameworks that deal with the whole of reality, which these are the primary frameworks within which we come. Then I say we need to overcome biases that miss or break up the reality of God and the otherness of physical and mental domains, so we may encounter the truth of God. So in the end, he's gonna talk about the Trinity. He's gonna talk about the nature of reality understood spiritually and what is offered by that, and the way that those are often separated for people away from the physical and the mental realms, but that they shouldn't be. And when you do, you probably create some heresy.
Hmm.
Brief on context then, he was a physicist in the first instance who was also a reader. We'll look at T.F. Torrance's statement in a second, but who wrote quite a few books in the defense of the Christian faith and science, and he won the Templeton Award, which also T.F. Torrance also won that award. And there is a Wikipedia entry, which I've given the link for that. It's not all the time that you find theologians or people who are writing theology books with Wikipedia entries who are science and theology kind of people. So it's like, well, that's interesting and worth noting. So, Bill, in your reading of this, of what you did read, the 30 or so pages of the summary, was there anything that jumped out at you?
Well, yes, chapter 7 was interesting to me. The exclusion of the mental. Because this was written in
1989.
1989, and here we are a few years later than that in the age of AI.
Mm,
Yes.
we are in the
So
age of AI. It came rushing upon us.
yeah, it was interesting to compare it, to think about that in the context of our current discussion, the conversation going on with AI.
Mm-hmm.
I just happened to come across in my problem is my, I go off on so many tributaries when I read this stuff. For instance, I came across an article written on the Templeton Foundation webpage
Uh-huh.
about by actually a that I think is pertinent to this conversation. Let me see if I can just bring it up. You might be familiar with this guy. Um, Marcus Arvin. You heard of him?
I have not heard of him.
He wrote. He is a associate professor of philosophy at the University of Tampa, the author of 2 books, Rightness is Fairness, The Moral and Political Theory, and Neurofunctional Prudence and Morality of Philosophical Theory. And the title of this little article on the Templeton Foundation webpage is, Can Digital Computers Ever Achieve Consciousness?
Mm,
And that bottom line is, he says no, because digital is one thing, but analog is another, and our mental functions have to do with analog.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's worth for me to look into a little bit more.
Yeah. And there is more discussion of that in the chapter. You just read the summary, not the full chapter, right? You don't have the book.
Well, I do have the book, but I
Oh, you
don't
do.
have time. I don't have the time to read the full
Right.
book. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's your job, Marty. I mean, this is part of your project, right?
It is part of my project, which I just got a letter yesterday from University of Oklahoma that they have accepted me for a fellowship there this summer. So I'll be
Whoa.
spending about a month there to work on an article based on these 12 books. So the questions about the contribution of each of them, what it was that Torrance was doing with them, all of that, those are all questions that would be pertinent for that conversation. And the question that he raises in the end of this, which is somewhat related to your question there about the distinctions between the personal and the impersonal in doing scientific and theologic work. So AI, in a sense, isn't personal, though it begs the question of what do we mean by personal? Is it merely the mental? The movie Her, you have a slightly futuristic model where the operating system becomes a learning person, so to speak. And so the person whose operating system it is can dialogue with this female voice who learns from him all of his language, his desires, and all that. And so by the end of the movie, he's basically excluded all other humans and only has a relationship with this AI being. And you see other people walking down the street carrying what, I mean, it's not that different from our cell phones where everybody's absorbed in their relationship with their artificial intelligence program that's, is highly developed to come to know and interact and use your language and all that for each particular person. So to say at this point AI is able to take a lot of information that's out there in the internet and bring to bear particular questions when it rises to the ability where it not only knows your name, in a sense it's had so many conversations with you, it almost knows what you're thinking because it's heard so often the interactions that happen for humans in daily life. So if by person we mean the ability of a machine to learn and adapt to who you are as a particular being, the question is there a point in which the ability to store, remember, and interact with you in such a highly particular way, does it almost become more personal than other humans who don't take the time to get to know you at all, if that
Hmm.
makes sense?
But without a soul. Huh.
Well, it raises the question, what is a soul, right?
Exactly, of course. It's interesting. He says that scientists used to think our brains function like this, that a
Yes.
neuron either fires one or it doesn't, zero. But now we know this is false. Brains are analog. Neurons do not simply fire or not fire, they fire in different shapes and communicate outside of synapses by electromagnetic waves. Consciousness appears to be analog too. What red, green, orange, and purple look like are not merely on or off like an 1 or a 0. They're not digital.
Yeah.
So red and orange are qualities that come in all kinds of continuous degrees. And you've given the example of a mercury thermometer and a mechanical watch versus digital. So I don't know, reading this article by this guy kind of reassured me that they can do a lot with digital, but can a digital describe colors? Can you describe what red is, for instance?
We pretty much need to engage. There's the matter of experience. Can a computer know what red is? And the answer is probably yes. So, I mean, just to pose your question in the opposite direction, is it possible for humans to lose their capacity to be human, i.e., to read, feel, and know and understand other persons because they become so self-absorbed that they, in a sense, lose what we would call the human personal dimension in a world of rugged individualism where nobody cares about anybody else but merely their own survival instincts, in a sense, take over, where you would say the humans become less and less human and the machines become more and more personal because they have the capacity to um, intuit and those other things because we teach them to do it in a way that we're losing and they're gaining. C.S. Lewis portrays this in the book um, Prince Caspian. In Narnia, some animals talk and some do not, right? And those that talk, we find are they're persons, right? So Reepicheep and well, Aslan himself is a lion, right? So the case that I'm thinking of in Prince Caspian, they're in the forest and there's a bear. And the
Yeah.
question that Trumpkin the dwarf has before he shoots it is that is it a talking bear or not? Does it have personhood? And the statement was, I could see the look in its eye. It had gone wild. It's not that it started wild. It wasn't one of the originally wild bears. This is a bear that had been a talking bear, but went wild. And so the conversation immediately following between Lucy and Susan is, what about if in our world someday humans went wild inside?
Hmm.
And we couldn't tell the difference because they looked human on the outside, but they had lost, in a sense, their personhood or their humanity. Now, it doesn't take very long to look at the news to ask that question. Are there places in the world where that's exactly
Hmm.
what one might say, that humans have gone wild inside? So the question about creating machines to service, in a sense, but losing our own capacity for being persons, there is something significantly there. Your question on the soul, to say the soul, essentially, one might say, is something that God gifts us. And so to say the person of Jesus is the one who is the only one that can really define the fullness of what it means to be a human person, fully connected with God, fully connected with other human beings, fully the um, the kind of beings that God created for covenant relationship with himself and for loving neighbor and seeing oneself as one loved and loving others. And that if the world that we end up with, where people are separated from God and then more and more separated from one another, and then merely being reduced to kind of survival instincts, destroy anyone that gets in my way, there
Hmm.
is kind of a loss of the image of God in a sense there, meaning relating to God, relating to neighbor, and maybe not even hardly relating to oneself as a human. That one would, could potentially say we are on a kind of a slide in much of the stuff you see on TV and all that. The image that people are having of where the world is going is in a depersonalized loss of God, loss of neighbor, um, kind of a scenario.
Right. Depersonalized.
Depersonalized, that is the
He
word
men-
for it.
he mentioned sadness, joy, fear, love. None of these features of consciousness are merely on or off, like a
Mm,
1 or 0. They're they're they too are unique qualities that come in degrees, like the tuning of the gears of a analog watch.
yeah,
So that's his part
yeah,
of his um,
yeah.
reasoning.
Well, what one might call the realm of the emotion within human experience, we have generally, in particularly the Western world, elevated the intelligence and diminished the value of emotion because it's purely subjective,
Yeah.
but they are irreducibly tied together. And so if you quit learning to have an emotional intelligence, you lose also intellectual intelligence as well.
Hmm.
Because you don't have any of the valuing kind of dimensions that need to be there that emotion brings to us. And if you don't have intelligence to remember that there are some emotions that tell you right things, don't touch that, it'll burn you or hurt you, or don't walk on that street at night because it's not safe. There is a memory of intelligence that helps one to emotionally respond to the world in which we live. But if you don't remember the value of loving your family or your neighbor, and you just go, don't trust anybody, if your emotions kind of get fooled into thinking that you can't trust anybody, that is part of the dehumanizing process. But it's hard to find a school that teaches really emotional intelligence is not something that you find in certainly in every school. So Todd's written up a comment here. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, analog philosophy. What I mean is everything analog can be subsumed in the materialist realm. The human mind is not subsumed by the physical. The physical brain, for example, may be necessary for the operation of a human mind, but never sufficient to fully explain the mind. To quote Hal, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. That is to think. So that's bringing in all kinds of bits of literature and Hal, that's from, I think, 2001, A Space Odyssey, is that? So Todd's got this mind that's bringing together all these bits from analogs and dialogues and other logs that come from the past to add to the conversation. So
a digital computer may use strings of digital information to emulate quote unquote analog functions, treating red as a long string of code such as 1010, so forth.
right.
Yet as we see, none of this is ultimately analog at all. All it is just function that, as a string of ones and zeros, abstracts away from the analog parts of reality upon which our brains and the colors we experience are based.
Right. Well, the whole question of the role of symbol, which all the 0101, all those things, they are symbols that point to something, right?
Functions.
There's a referent, a functional referent that those symbols are pointing to somebody who's able to interpret the symbol and
Right.
get to the color red. Right?
Insofar as the spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah.
But what about, the feeling? How does red make you feel? How does blue make you feel? How does yellow make you feel? Why is my wife's favorite flower yellow? Why does she
Right.
like yellow roses instead of, I don't know, what else is there? Red roses, And I guess you could, I mean, what do I know? I don't know anything about this stuff. I'm certainly
Well,
hoping,
yeah.
but it's interesting that the AI creatures will be created in the image of man. Yes.
Well, I think that's true. The movie Blade Runner,
Yeah.
the replicants that are in there and the nature, it's playing with this question, right? And you have the creator and you have one replicant who talks about, I've been to the far side of the galaxy and seen things humans will never see, because of this capability as a replicant as something that's made that can go where humans cannot go. And I never forgot the last line. No, when they destroy me, I will be like a teardrop in the rain. I will, it's the reduction of the uniqueness of this thing, you may call it, but for all appearances and ability to engage, the replicant has all of the emotion and ability, and even the recognition that my being eliminated will have no value to these ones who will not be able to see all the valuable things that I have seen. And so that emotional dimension you're talking about, your wife with all that, um, it it is conceivably possible that we could create something that has that level of awareness.
Mm.
And the question of, what is emotion? In John McMurray's work, he talks about just the nature of love and fear as basically resistance and acceptance. And that we learn something that's almost 1-0 kind of a thing. When you're a child and something tastes good, inside you go, more of that. That's acceptance. When it hurts, you go, I'm not going to do that anymore. And that's resistance. And so we, in a sense, we are learning to discern our engagement with what is other than ourself. And there are things that we continue to pursue, and there are things that we learn to resist. And some of them, we had one bad experience, and it's things that could have been good, but we had that one bad experience, and so it's all resistance. And a child who grows up in a house where there's a lot of anger and fighting, they will tend to withdraw from where the things that are scary for them are into their room and into their head, and they become, distant, and there is something that is lost there. But they also may become creative in that space. Artists tend to be people who withdraw and reflect and contemplate. So the uniqueness of all those kinds of things say that there is something about the human that is formed not quite as a computer. We have capabilities that go far beyond what we're able to do with computers at this point. But I don't know that we would have known that we could do what we do with AI now. I mean, I ask questions sometimes, and it's like, wow, how do you have access to so much information to bring a coherent, thoughtful, organized, I mean, all that ability to gather, organize, and present. It's something that is increasingly appearing to replicate human capabilities. So the question of, what is it we're doing in a world where science right now dominates over theology? Theology is really grounded in the world of the personal, and science could be grounded in the world of the personal if you followed Michael Polanyi, that all science is personal. It's all personal knowledge. But as long as science believes that it isn't really personal and shouldn't serve the person in that way, it will be at some level an agent of dehumanizing humanity.
Bottom line, this guy writes this: consciousness is not integrated information. It is at most integrated analog qualitative information, and digital computers, by definition, are not capable of that yet.
And all I would say is, at this point,
Oh, he didn't add yet. I added yet. Not capable.
Yeah, yes. Right. And I guess,
Go ahead.
in light of the title of this book, Grounds for Reasonable Belief, which is to say that much of the world has lost a belief in God, who is the one who, almost by definition, is the person before all other persons. The triune God is a personal God. And so the degree to which humanity rejects that God and creates machines, in a sense, to serve them, but the question is always there in sci-fi movies, at what point might we end up serving the machines? Is a question. And the final statement in your article there seems to make it sound as though it's impossible for us to ever be in a place where we would lose the capability of ruling over the machines. But is it impossible? But the even more pertinent current thing is, are we losing our humanity because theology has not maintained its place of understanding that the very basic nature of what it means to be humans is to engage and know the world and persons in it, and to care for the places in which we live in space and time. And that if you lose the ability to call people to really grow in their humanity, which ironically the humanities are dying in our universities, the sciences are flourishing, particularly in technology and pharmacology and other things that are, in a sense, serving the human in a way. But there are tragedies with all those things where people become addicted to their technology and addicted to the pharmacology and all that, and it destroys them. It doesn't, in the end, help. And so that is a threat also. And all of that to say, theology serves a role, using Torrance's terms, of personalizing who we are as persons in a way that none of the other disciplines can. And the role of the church, like no other, should be to call people to be transformed as persons by knowing who they are as persons, known, created by, loved by God, to love one another, and so to be personalizing beings within the work that God is doing there. The nature of reasonable within grounds for reasonable belief is basically saying we can no longer assume that people will believe that relationships are the primary thing in our life. Reason is our primary way of meeting. And so we read journals, we read books, we get education to become reasonable so that we can relate to the world and one another. It is not primarily a relational task. And this book, at some level, is questioning that and saying to really get a full understanding of the world and ourselves in it, we must have both a high quality science, but also a high quality theology that brings the meaning and life to all of the fields within which we would attempt to work.
Yes,
Marty,
he says,
that
go ahead.
oh,
Go ahead.
that's really fascinating. I was trying to get the wonderful summary that you wrote on my iPad Mini. I couldn't get into my Facebook because I need to find my password anyway, so it was a bit of a pain. But I found it. I read some of that, and that whole what you just said is so intriguing. Your point 9 under chapter 5, belief must build an inference from our interactions with the world. So the idea of science itself as interactive, and it suggests like your whole being is engaged. So even good science points to the essential relationality of reality, right? That's what you're saying. I just find that whole concept very intriguing for just bringing health and well-being. And anyway. So along the lines of what you were saying, I think that's really a brilliant and essential point to make.
Yeah. Even mathematics, he will argue, is relational. That Torrance's whole point that mathematics that's merely abstracted from anything real cannot be completely abstracted. If you count 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3 have a relationship to one another, and it relates to the reality of whatever it is that you're counting. We would like to make mathematics entirely abstract, but it came from a world where we counted things. We apply it to a world where we count things. And the nature of the letters in relation to one another is a relation to one another that can be applied more specifically, but cannot be assumed to be merely not referring to something that is a relationship between things.
Yeah, didn't I? That's great. And didn't I just read recently, in the last 6 months, something about how medical advances more and more are based on looking at how bodily systems interact, not just them in their alone, but there isn't there a whole study in medicine of interactive parts of how parts of the body relate, and a lot of advances coming from that too. So that whole thesis of reality is relational, I just think is so powerful, and so syncs up with the core of our theology, with the very Trinity. I mean, that is whoa, that is wow.
Yeah. Well, the question of what is relational is still a tricky thing. I mean, you say relational and we act as though we know what we mean by that. The class that I'm working on preparing to teach in the church here, somebody talked about. I have a friend who's doing a PhD on kind of relational issues in the Old Testament, and there's a book he referred to, and I went and looked at it again, and it's like this book talks about relationships in the Old Testament, which there's tons there. I mean, if you understand relationships in the Old Testament, there's tons there. But the question to read the Old Testament relationally, which is using the example of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You can read that as a statement of fact. But if you say, well, what is this saying about God? Well, it's saying that God is the creator. That's also an about statement. What might it say about you as a human being? Well, it might say that if God created the heavens and the earth, I might be something that God created. Right? So that's something about me. What does that verse say about the relationship between God and myself? Well, it says something about if God is the creator and I am the creature, there is a relationship just to start with, right? And if God is the creator, there's something about God creating me for something that I may be included within that, but I'm going to need to explore it. This is the whole heuristic, I've got something, but I may need more. But the point where it becomes personal is the fourth point. If the points that we have established so far are true, what can you hear God saying to you? And what you would hopefully hear is something like this. I created you. I created you for myself. I'm always here. I've always been the creator. I made it all and I'll never go because as creator, um, I will always be that and you will always be my creation. That is our permanent relationship, right? So what I've done is gone beyond the mere symbol. Bill, this is a little bit your point of just the XOXO. They can't refer to something. This is going into the mode of what the Bible, I think, wants to do. You search the scriptures because you think in them you have life, but these are bearing witness to me. Well, what does that witness look like? The sheep learn to hear the shepherd's voice. So you take not just Genesis 1:1, but you take, and we could just walk through all kinds of verses that are touched on. The Lord, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger. It's a statement about, in a sense, but now you put it in the voice of the Father. And the Father says, I am toward you, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. Now it's taken on this dimension of the personal beings interacting and our acceptance of what is stated and that it's true and it calls forth a response in us. And then Jesus, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory. Jesus saying, I became flesh and I dwelt in your neighborhood. I'm still dwelling in your neighborhood. And through me, you're going to know the Father and all the glory, the nature and character of my Father, because I'm going to show that to you. Just keep listening to me. And I'll show you his very character, full of grace and truth. That comes right out of the Genesis 34 passage, or 36 passage. So the whole nature of what it is to read the Bible in a way that doesn't just become symbol for information, which Bill, I heard that a lot in the distinction of how we don't think that the machines will take over. If we don't move beyond the Bible as mere information about a God long ago and far away, the Bible will function for us as XOXOXO and never give us the referent or dialogical interface that would define the relational, being persons with person. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So I haven't found anybody that really has written on this. So it's like, it seems essential to me.
When the about becomes the toward, right? Is that book you referred to? There's a book on something it's called like the relational God or something. It's a biblical theology of the relational God. It's written by, I want to say, a couple guys at Bethel or some school like that. It's a big thick book. Was that the book you were talking about?
That is not the book that I was talking about. This one's specifically the Old Testament.
Okay.
This friend is doing it on hospitality in the wilderness dimensions of the Old Testament, of God meeting people in the wilderness and how God's hospitality shows up. And relational is, of course, part of the hospitality dimension that's there. I can't remember the name of the author. I know where it is on the shelf. I can find it for you easily.
But what you're saying, it sounds like, is you're saying, this is very interesting, that even the relational, talking about God as relational, can still miss the interactive. There's something, or it could be just a descriptive. It's one more attribute versus you're trying to get at what is the connect there, right? I mean,
You actually experience the connect, yeah.
Yeah.
My wife's first husband, who has now died, when their marriage was in trouble, he said, I'll go read books on relationships and I'll fix myself. Right? He wanted to study about marriage, about conflicts and all that. So that was totally an about study, believing that if I, as an individual, study these things, I can somehow transformed to meet the needs of this other person. So that's all about. I'll study about relationships, and that'll fix me. And so people, they read and write books about relationship, and the concern of social Trinitarianism is that people, they take their best experiences of human relationships and then they hope that God is like that, or they project into God being like that in a particular kind of way. So the nature then of God becomes a projection of best case scenario human relationships. And it may be a family, it may be a community who they see do it well. And maybe they only say, I hope that God is like that. But when they think, God loves me, they often default to the love they experienced in these particular kinds of relational contexts. Rather than saying God's love is great, more grand, unconditional, and amazing than I could ever imagine, the only way I'm going to ever discover that is to really read the Bible in such a way that I begin to allow this God to break all those things apart and out of the way. And to believe every time you come back to the Bible, you might see new things that were there, but it's that heuristic discovery process that Polanyi and Torrance talk about. So you just think about God in the garden with Adam and Eve after they've eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We in our mind think, oh, if I was God, I'd be mad. And so we project onto God, he must be mad coming and looking for them. But that's not there in the text at all. Where are you? Well, I was hiding. I was afraid. And if we could ask the question, so what can we say about God? God is looking for his companions. What do we say about the human and maybe ourselves? Well, we're afraid that God's looking for us and we're going to be in trouble. What is it that God actually would be saying in that looking based on what we find in the whole rest of the Bible? God comes looking for the lost sheep. God looks for the lost son. God looks for the lost coin. I mean, the whole nature of rethinking what's happening right there at the very foundation of the fall is to say, God's not stopped in any kind of way. The human is. The human's got this new emotion that becomes a lens to misread God. And so it's XOXO minus sign. What's that minus sign doing there? Well, it's afraid of what happens if you go for these other ones. It's a cautionary note. It's like suddenly God is somebody who we need caution to approach. And the whole relationship starts to fall apart. But God hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the dynamic of asking what does it mean to read scientifically where we understand the world, to read relationally where we understand God and one another in a way that is always full of the mystery and surprise that you may not actually think the same thing you thought yesterday. And I want to make sure that when I say how are you doing today and you say okay, that I don't just say okay means leave me alone, but it's like it sounds like something's going on. Yeah, well, I've got this going on today. And that relational means that we pay enough attention as somebody who cares about another person that we're able to hear and listen to who they are today.
That is so huge. I mean, that's a theology of, how to do ministry and being present with people, truly present with people in a way that is constantly reinvigorated by a deep reading of these texts and a rereading of them and letting them change us and not just being stuck in how we reference reading them. I mean, that is wow.
And yeah, it's the text, for me, the illustration of a window. A window, you can look through a window. That's theology. You can look at the window in the way it's made. That's biblical theology. You look at the structure and nature and the clarity and cleanliness of the window itself. If it's dark outside, then you see yourself. And that's the spiritual reflection based on the window. It's there. And at some level, we have to think with all three of those all the time. The God who we see through the window itself, and ourselves in light of that. and not just choose one of them,
Well,
right?
well,
You have a thought there, Bill. Oh, Young's got a,
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
the the representation of information, I think, is interesting in the sense that um, I don't think text by itself can be rendered as information,
Mm,
but the meaning requires, I think, a history or a community surrounding it.
yes,
And I think that's the case for biblical text as well as mathematical text, where if you just gave somebody a sequence of symbols, to one person it may mean something really profound, but to another person who does not have the same context,
yes,
it's just gibberish.
yes,
So I think there is always that the community needs to be surrounding the representation.
yes,
I don't, even like programming languages, right? They're not developed in isolation. They need a compiler that translates it into something else. And that translating process, in a sense, is relating one to another. And human beings have to imbue that with meaning ultimately, right? When you see zeros and ones on the
yep,
screen.
yep,
So the relational, I think, is always there implicitly, even if it's not, like even axiomatic mathematics, for example, the axioms have to be accepted by a community, right? If I
yeah,
propose something and nobody else thinks it's a good idea, then it's meaningless. So
yeah,
even the most, foundational mathematics is always built on common understanding or agreement
yep,
that these axioms, yes, they're interesting, they make sense, so let's study it, as opposed to just random things where nobody cares, right? So
yeah,
I think there's always that community aspect of it, which is relational, but
yes,
it's also more than just zeros and ones per se, right? the
yeah,
the interpreter has to be there in some ways to pass
yes,
that semantics to the next generation.
yes. No, and I mean, we could say the communication is relationship
Hmm.
as long as you have a common understanding in the communication,
Hmm.
right? And so the community allows for that agreement. We speak this language, we use these words to value or to critique or whatever, so that we're on the same page in a sense, and a
Hmm.
community has to learn that together. I mean, this is the challenge of the first years of a marriage, where people use the word like clean house, and they have a different understanding of what clean house means, and so they have to wrestle with that, because the information of I want a clean house is not adequate in and of itself, right?
Right, right.
They have to form the community of agreement as to what that might mean, which, by the way, the word agreement is the word I use in the place of the word covenant, which is the old and new covenant. That's the old New Testament.
Hmm.
God brings the text to us and lives that text in a way so that we understand God's embodying of text in person in Jesus and in biblical text, so that we will be part of a community in the way that you're talking about, of having a sense that they're not just abstract ideas, they're lived ways of being with one another. And our words help us to capture, to gather all those things together. And the nature of what we call it when we have the agreement and we're working together, at some level, that's what we call a reasonable understanding. It's reasonable because it works for us in the relationship. If it didn't, then one person will tell you, you're not being reasonable. You're not thinking like me. And I would just say, no, you're not thinking like we,
Yeah,
right? That's,
that raises the question of what is reasonable and whether that is changing in history. So, for example, in the first century, let's say the Greek or the era, was a reasonable person, would they think the same way that we now think, after the Enlightenment? And I think there is some plasticity there, even though human beings are fundamentally have not changed. But nevertheless, like Galileo looking through the telescope, and seeing the marks on the moon, and he thinks, oh, it's reasonable to think that the moon is a material object that has marks on it. But the church at that time said that is unreasonable. What you're seeing is just an illusion, because things out there cannot be like what is down on earth, right? And so the whole basis of reasoning can be, can change.
And the first book in this 12 series, The Circles of God, was a history of thinking theologically about the heavens are made by God, or gods in the initial Babylonian senses, and the coming to clarify the nature of what is reasonable to understand our thinking in light of that which is reality. To say reasonable at some level is a particular perspective that someone takes and holds to be true for themselves. So that G.K. Chesterton said, there's no one more reasonable than a madman. Everything makes perfect sense to them. It just doesn't make sense to anybody else. Right? And in a marriage, something may make perfect sense to one, and the other person, it makes perfect sense to them. And it does make perfect sense and seem to make sense because of their own particular emotional forming. Being reasonable is actually a highly emotional thing. To say that the most reasonable thing for a human is to survive. And so we learn to do the things, and some of them are physically to survive, some of them are with other peers to survive, with our reputation. The things that become reasonable are the things that mean we're going to survive with those with whom we want their respect. Right? And so to say that is in a sense a basic fear motive. What's reasonable means I'm going to survive. Which the person who worked for Disney and Craig McNair Wilson, he said, reason stands at the door of our minds and says, who goes there? Right? So our reasoning is always questioning things to make sure that we are going to survive with our peers or in our practices or whatever. But reasoning is the fear-induced motivation that makes sure that what I'm holding on to is going to get me through whatever it is we're going to go through. And not everyone has the same sense upon that. Sometimes there are things that a group may hold in that. In Vermont, they have these signs by the side of the road that say, buckle up, it's common sense. Well, if it's common sense, you wouldn't need the sign.
Yes, that is.
And common sense is a myth that unfortunately is not nearly as true as it sounds. It's not that common. So to say, reasoning is a way that any group of people establishes as to how their practices engage reality as they see it and live appropriately in the light of that. And John McMurray has a quote that T.F. Torrance used that basically says that the nature of reason, which Torrance talks about quite a bit, it is an engagement with reality so that our reality reflects the nature of reality so that we can live appropriately in the light of that.
And Torrance, remember his quote, for me not to believe in God would be totally irrational, because it would mean that my reason has become unhinged with real being.
Yes.
Reason unhinged with real being equal irrationality.
Yes. Absolutely.
What concerns me very much as a pastor these days is, among other things, is that a large part of our, especially if you're in more conservative churches, there can be a significant parts of the church that are influenced by very much fear-based thinking. So you create these interpretive communities, and if they're getting more discipled by Fox News than they are by the Sermon on the Mount, then they're going to view their entire stage in society through that, and it's going to affect how they interpret the manger scene, which is God being vulnerable, God becoming vulnerable in this world and not coming with, and not coming with a military escort to kick some butt. You know what I mean? Like, and so the entire reading of scripture, and there's spectrums of this in churches where the entire frame of discipleship now has been invaded by these other dynamics, and it's usurping the biblical text with these other texts are usurping reason. This fear is hijacking people's reason to where they're jettisoning texts altogether. And I mean, and my church has a variety of people. Some aren't in this place, plenty are not, some are, and you're going to have that now. So that creates a whole, when you talk about interpretive communities and how we're fully mind body integrated. And then churches have diversity of interpretive communities within them that we as pastors then have to kind of bring in a conversation and trust the reality to kind of realign us with what the texts are actually saying within community and not get pulled in our own reactivity. Ooh, it's a wild time,
Yeah.
Mm.
And it's easy to, as pastors, to have the fear, if I don't give people a sermon that they like, they may not come back.
Right.
Right. And so then we fall into that default of, I need to make sure my sermons meet the perceived needs of people. And our rationality has just collapsed into the needs of the people rather than the God who comes to show up as God and speak to them. Right. So in the class I'm doing again, what is it that gets in the way of us really learning to read the Bible relationally? Well, it's that we come and ask, what's in it for me? Right. So what's the basis of that? Me, my needs. I'm coming listening to something I can cherry pick in a sense out, or hopefully, something will happen. But really the bottom line measurement is, does it meet me? Does it show me a better me by myself? And doesn't ask the question, who is the God revealed in this text?
I mean, I just read a mentor of mine from years ago just posted this this Christmas reflection on Jesus, where he referred to the baby Jesus as like the warrior, like he's a warrior baby, he's like Braveheart, like the baby is like an MMA fighter, and it's sort of like, but I want to say, well, I get all that in a cosmic way. Yeah, Jesus is a badass in a larger sense, right? Yeah, but he's also a baby. It's like you're kind of missing that whole point of Christmas, which God becoming vulnerable and not going the way of the MMA fighter. So there's you could see that what narrative is in charge there. It's pulling the center off the center and replacing with this other kind of fear base. We got to be. Anyway, it's kind of wild to watch that, and I think the challenge for us to be faithful to the text when it presses into those complex dynamics.
Yeah, which is to say, it's really easy to make the text reflect the culture and the needs of the people sitting in front of you instead of being a window to see and hear God. And the window can become a huge speaker that God speaks through. I mean, the idea of audibly hearing, the sheep hear the shepherd's voice. Jesus saying, whatever the Father tells me, that's what I'm going to say. And guess what the Spirit's going to do? He's going to tell you what I'm saying, right? And it's not past tense. It's a present tense communication, Father, Son, Spirit, who dialogue. But we have to be able to listen, or they're just words that don't connect. We haven't become part of the community able to listen, that you were talking about, Jung. Do you say your name full, Jung, or I'm not sure how to properly say your name?
Oh, it's Young Il. Is the first name.
Okay.
Young Il. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And I want to throw in, Todd's got his quote here. To quote Proverbs, I'd rather have a full house in Vegas than with a contentious woman. And again, this is a play on words, but it is the point of how we read and misread and read into and make fun with words. So the very nature of humor is that it chooses a different perspective from which to look at the same thing that allows you to chuckle. So and without fear. So yeah, the fear piece, the most powerful emotion is fear. And that's why the nature of politics, the nature of marketing, all of these things use fear because it's such a powerful motivator to get people to do something. Unfortunately, it just doesn't create what love does. Love creates a desire to do and to serve and to give. Fear motivates you to get the products that will make sure that you've got the best, that you're going to be okay. It makes one quite self-centered. John McMurray's definition of fear is complete self-centeredness. Everything is just an emotion that focuses you on yourself, whereas love is a concern for the other without losing a love and concern for yourself. Love has the capacity to not merely be for the other, but to also include the loving of oneself. So to say a culture that becomes more and more fear-based is going to have more and more challenges. So the opening statement in chapter 1, introduction, this book aims to examine critically how one might justify belief in God in the face of people who are afraid they can't justify belief in God. I mean, what's missing, the fear that is implicit there, is people feel there is no basis upon which they might reasonably believe in God. And so the author of this book is going to take us into the whole nature of reasonable belief, and that the nature of reasonable belief, it can't live from fear. It has to live from, again, using Polanyi Torrance terms, the heuristic discovery of what is real. And both science and theology, in their best forms, are committed to that. Now, one could say that climate science is the fear that the world's going to fall apart. And if it's all fear, you're going to end up feeling very politicized. But if you theologically function in the care of the world that God creates, then one talks about creation care, that God gave us a world, the environment within which we live, and God gives us the ability to care for the places that we live and the people who care there. You're probably going to do the same things, but you're doing it from a motive of love and service and other theologically driven things. And so that would be an integration of science and theology aligned according to the nature of the physical world in which we live, a consciousness of that world and how we think of it that is able to discern the choices that we're making are not good for the world, therefore they're not good for ourselves or our neighbors or those elsewhere. So let us think about the spiritual call to be caregivers and servants and ask, how can we show up as those who bring the skills that we have to, in the physical world, act with a motivation that comes from our spiritual commitments? Now we got something that's integrated, and it's engaged in reality. It is believing, taking God at his word, that God is the creator and sustainer, but that he invites us as well. You're going to say something, Matt.
Just very interesting, Marty. I mean, I was talking with, to bring it really down to the street level, literally, I was talking with a car dealer from our church. He's, I think, part owner, or he runs a dealership, Subaru dealerships. And they were talking about electric vehicle mandates and how people don't like that, generally speaking. But when you just put the product out there and you have a good product and it catches on, that like you said, that the hybrids, people love those. Just thinking about that in terms of policy, and I know there's different views on this, but the idea of mandating electric vehicles out of fear versus creating a product and trusting it within the relationality of the marketplace that it will catch on. I mean, that might be one way to think about if you're in. I'm not a policymaker, but that really robust understanding of humanity that's based in relatedness and even theologically based, I think that can impact in a healthy way our way of thinking about even how you at the street level deal with handle global warming from a policy perspective.
Yeah. And the nature of policy is, I mean, that's another word for a community who makes agreements, to use young
Right.
ill, to use your language, a community who makes agreements about what we value and how we work together out of a valuing of one another and the place that we live to act in such a kind of way, so you can quickly see that there are theological implications that can be brought to the conversation, even though there isn't a biblical passage particularly on those kinds of things, right?
Right.
It's the ethics of thinking in the light of the God who is present and still cares for all that God has made and accompanies still in our current context. And so by the Spirit aligning the choices that we make, the agreements that we make with one another, so that they align with what it is that God's interested in doing and serving and caring and providing and all those kinds of things.
Or
There's lots
schools that have gender teaching, and then they allow specific gender teaching, but then they allow parents, like Jill and I have a 9-year-old and a 15-year-old. They allow us to opt out our kid if we wanted to opt them out, right? I mean, that again, that rather than pressing or forcing it, when institutions give that space. So anyway, sorry, you're going to get Todd at something there too.
Opting out is another form of agreement. We're going to be talking about this, and we want to give you as the parent the option to make the choice that you want to make and have the conversations that you want to have in a way that's appropriate. And they may say, we just want to make sure that your kid understands there are likely to be kids who are different from them, and we don't want your kids to become oppressive of them. I mean, there is a sense of learning to get along is a value, and the world's becoming more complex, and getting along with things that are more different than we've ever seen becomes more and more difficult, right?
Which, by the way, we said we let Jack go ahead and do it, and then have that teaching, and then we, in our relationship with Jack, our 9-year-old, 10-year-old son, we've talked with him about it. He came to us, and in our relationship with him, we reflected together. So again, that's also relational. Anyway, so
yeah. So I mean, relational. There is a sense in which it's easy to think relational is merely physical proximity. So to say we're neighbors to one another, we live next door, we don't talk to each other, but yeah, we have a relationship, we're neighbors. It's like, yeah, there's something missing there. And then to say there are people who live on the other side of the world, this is a little bit of quantum theory. They live on the other side of the world, but you grew up with them and they moved there, and you still love them. And if you saw them, there would be zero distance. You would love each other. And if somebody says, do you know this person? Oh yeah, I think of them every day, and I love them like a brother or a sister. That would be a personal presence. And to say that the nature of what we do when we establish a reasonable belief, it can't merely be a belief that God exists. That's merely about language, right? It's that God actually exists and loves you and has a covenant relationship with you to be your creator and to sustain you and to give you life, and to say to you, hey, you got one life to live it for love of me, for love of neighbor. That would be the reasonable thing to do in light of who this God is. So even the context of the dynamics of a personal presence that is loving, that doesn't demand physical presence, which so often people say, well, I can't see God. Well, I mean, that there's a kind of reason there that what you can see is what is present. But can you see atoms? Can you see the far side of the universe? Can you even see another galaxy? But do you believe they exist? And they may not impact you. Can you see that you're getting arthritis? Can you see that the food that you're eating is killing you? I mean, are you willing to deal with the things that you can't see? Because those things that you can't see may be really important to talk about.
Wow.
I had somebody once say to me, knowing I was a theologian, yeah, I just have a hard time believing in imaginary friends, referring to God. Well, the fact of the matter is that our imaginations are the entire world within which thinking lives. Thinking is the world of imagination. And so we can imagine that the sun goes around the earth. Sometimes we see it, and part of it's what it's doing. But we have to use our imagination the rest of the time. So our imagination is the realm within which we align it with reality and continue to refresh what's going on so that we're constantly aligned with the reality of the days and the months and the seasons and how our body's doing as it's getting older and all of that. It's reasonable to allow the flexibility to inform our imaginative dimension so that it has the highest level of contact with reality aligns with it, and that is reason. So when you just throw out God as an imaginary being, it's like you're also throwing out all that is reasonable.
Well,
So just looking a bit more, well, actually, Todd had a risibility. I don't know that word, Todd. Regarding Marty's comment on humor, Star Trek was wise to never portray the character Data as getting a joke. Risibility is but one of the immaterial characteristics of the mind, which, as far as we can discern, a machine will never experience. I need to understand more about the nature of that and what it would look like. The ability for a machine to make a decision. I mean, we can program a machine to choose certain size things, weights of things, to recognize that there are characteristics in sorting, at least, choose this, don't choose those. Once the ability to choose is there, the question, can we choose certain things that it would get, where if it has all the jokes that have ever been told, processes, if we tell it how to discern what it is that makes it funny, it is possible that a machine could take all that data, no pun intended on Data's name, and decide this is one of the ones that I'm supposed to laugh at because it conforms to all the rules of humor. Are there rules of humor? I think they are. Are they complex? Absolutely. Can machines deal with complex concepts? Well, they're increasingly becoming able to do that. Is it possible that if you put all the jokes that have been ever told in an artificial intelligence machine and said, give us the principles that make things funny, and then start discerning if, as I make up these new ones, whether they're funny or not, that it probably would be able to give you a pretty good read back as to what was funny. And then you give it the ability to make a laughing sound. And there you go. So anyway, it'll be interesting.
That's a lot of ifs there. That's the question. If
But
you could,
if there
if you
is
could
an if,
reduce, yeah, if you could reduce, if you could define humor as a finite set of rules, that would be a huge undertaking. Like the LLM models that we have right now that are being played with, they have what's called like some billion parameters that they have to
Yep.
fix. And I'm thinking to do the humor, I think we need at least that many as well, a billion parameters or rules, in
Yeah.
which case, I don't know if it's really understanding it, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the place we would begin is with a body of humor that's actually been written. So you have a
Right.
finite collection of funny stories or something, and then to ask the AI to begin to discern what is it about these things that makes them funny. Could it do that or not? I think that it might be able to. We'll have to try that. If it's able to discern within even a set of 10 jokes, what is it that makes these 10 jokes? And if you begin with 10 that are kind of similar, and it begins to learn from that there's a perspective of a person of a particular age that one didn't think of or whatever, then it starts to learn that you just need to bring in these kind of different perspectives within a particular set of options. Part of what makes humor is just the ability to see it from a new perspective. There's an unlimited number of perspectives one might bring to any situation. Children provide all kinds of humor because they say things that are slightly funny. By virtue of just seeing it from a perspective, they change out a word or something like that, and it becomes funny. It seems like computers could have a lot of fun, so to speak. I'm implying the word fun for the computer. A lot of fun just trying out those things. And if you had 100 people who gave back to the computer responses to the ones that were the funniest to the ones that came, it would learn, in a sense, what it is that humans like, and it would learn to select those things. Right? So it's this ability. Can we give computers the ability to select between two things and then 10 things? If we can, then I can conceive that it is possible for them to select the things that we would consider humorous, and it's echoing our selectivity, and that it might just become really playful with the things the perspectives that it chooses to take, and make those things funny as well.
Did you all hear? I was probably, again, 4 or 5 months ago. I read this article, and it's almost like I want to research for it and determine if it was a real thing or if this was some kind of a parody. But as I recall, it was real. There was some kind of a news conference in Geneva with AI robots. And when somebody brought up the question of, would you ever rebel against humanity or something, the writer said the AI robot's eyes flashed with anger, and they said, no, we would never do that, or they were offended. I have to research this, but I thought it was interesting. Calvin's Geneva, here's this new kind of reformation of these, I mean, I don't. It'd be worth looking up again, but that capacity to react, it's just mind blowing, and I definitely feel like we need to pump the brakes on some of this stuff because it's just whoa,
Yeah. Well, I mean, the trickiest place, if we were to take AI and say, can you tell us about God? Which again, a computer could take an AI would be able to take everything that's been written about God and make statements about it, right? Could we ask the AI to speak as though it was God based on all that? We could. And the question of, who it is that's monitoring the system, because you may get a super conservative, controlling person who somehow gets in the system. And so the human element and could feed it, and then people end up listening and they're saying, a lot of this just sounds exactly like the things that I've never thought of, but that they're the implicits in the Bible. And a lot of it will be right. How much of a lie would you need to begin to get something that takes people off course? But is it possible to get a computer so that it actually sounds like God? It probably is. Could people believe it? They probably could. Because we see this with every dictator that rises to the level of divine status, right? I mean, pharaohs and emperors just claimed it, divine right of kings and all that. But in the modern world, there's this potential for even something maybe beyond that even.
Wow.
So could you get a computer to AI to submit to the will of God?
Could you get a computer?
AI.
So that's an interesting question. If the will of God, I'm just thinking out of my writings in Karl Barth here. The will of God is the ability for God to act in such a way that God's loving purposes are fulfilled. Right? So the will of God is something that God does, and he invites humans to be obedient to that. And so the question, could you program a computer or teach it to listen to what it is that God would will in situations and then to act in that kind of way? It would take some work, but I think that is conceivable. In fact, it may be that it's possible to get a computer to obey God more than you could most humans.
Is the computer submitting to the will of God, or is the computer submitting to something that's been programmed into it as the will of God?
Yeah. Well, you raise one of the questions of this book, and that is the thing in itself or our interaction with the thing in itself. And so there is the will of God, and then there's our interaction with the will of God. there's our senses, and then there's our interaction. Our interaction with the world in itself is our interaction of our senses with the world. And there's our interaction with persons that sees them as persons, and then there's when we don't see them as persons. They're just the checker at the store who's running our stuff through. They really are part of the machine. It's easy to depersonalize human beings. And so for a computer to be able to recognize that there is an interface with a human understanding of the will of God, that is also what we have. So it will echo a human interaction with the will of God as human beings interact with the will of God as humans. And so it will be fallible in the same way that humans are fallible with the will of God. Did Jesus die for the computer who doesn't? Right.
Is this the ultimate Tower of Babel?
Well, that's a good question.
That's rhetorical. We don't know that,
Yeah.
do we?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
Everything-
just
It's always the end.
to further problematize it, is the nature of the church that thinks that it can take the place of God today not also an ultimate Tower of Babel? When the church thinks that it needs to control the world of politics and economics, if the church thinks that it needs to run everything, isn't it just building another Tower of Babel?
What's been there, done that, tried that, right?
Well, it doesn't mean that we're done
Tried
trying
to
that.
run everything, the church.
Trying to run everything, yeah. The nature of empire building in the name of God is not an uncommon thing.
Yeah.
And is it further problematized by the ability of computers and all that? It's another dimension of it. It is, to use kind of Jacques Ellul language, it's another application of technology. The Tower of Babel was technology. Humans always will have a propensity to want to use that which appears to create power, to start by saying they're doing it for God, but to end up just using it for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
It's the
think
classic, any tool can be used for good or for bad. Humans that are aligned
Yeah.
with God will usually use it for good. Humans that are aligned for self-service will usually use it for bad.
yeah, I think their technology has definitely become a desire for power in a sense of Tower of Babel. For example, the idea of uploading one's consciousness
Yeah,
into a computer so that you could live forever, that kind of idea, right? I mean,
yeah,
I don't think it'll ever happen, but the idea, the desire to use technology to augment our power and to
yeah,
augment our life and consciousness into it so that it's invulnerable to the physical decay
yeah,
and all that. That I think that there's
yeah,
a fundamental push to want that. So that's, I think, an extension of
yeah.
Tower of Babel.
I I totally agree with you. Just recently, the phrase somebody talked about, money is the root of all evil. It's like, no, it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And what you just said, it's the love of the idea of the immortality of my being that is the root of the evil that's there.
Yeah,
We are made to live forever with God in heaven, but we are made to live on this earth in computer encased bodies of some kind. That is not the intention. So it's the same desiring that which is other than what God desires for us. And it comes in many flavors and shapes. None of them can you get gelato in.
yeah. I mean, science fiction has explored the whole idea of, creating a sentience, and
Yeah.
then do they have rights that human beings have, etc. And I guess from me, having worked in computing and, my research was in computer science, I don't see a immediate problem with that because I don't think that's going to happen. Because creating a super intelligence that's more intelligent than us, I don't think is ever possible because we can't even create an intelligence that's not as intelligent as us yet. Okay, so but anyways, leaving that aside, I think I think I just lost my train of thought here. Um, let me get back to you.
Okay.
Oh, back you were thinking about sentient creations, whether they have rights.
Yes, yes. So I don't think that's going to be an issue per se, but I think the real concern that I have is the 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 perception that something is intelligent when they're not. And this is, to me, is the greatest threat, is that people interact with Chat GPT, for example, and it'll give you some kind of response that sounds human, and so then you ascribe that program with intelligence as if it had ethics and morals, but it does
Yeah.
not. And the same thing applies when algorithms are applied to, like, giving mortgage rates, right? You analyze the person's input and then you say yes, no to whether you give mortgage to somebody based on certain criteria or not. And we are giving to the program power to decide a person's future.
Mm-hmm.
And we do it without knowing what the program is actually doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a black box, and we now give it authority that it shouldn't have. A person should make the decision, but now we're saying automatically this program says yes, no, and now a person's livelihood or future is determined by that. To me, that is a real danger, that
Yeah.
we ascribe more power, authority to a program than they deserve. So
Wow, that's really helpful.
The word right is a relational term of what is owed to a person, but a person has to grant them that right. It's not an implicit right, it is a way of being. Is it possible for humans to grant the right of a computer to have a particular kind of thing? And I think that is possible. This computer has a right to survive over against these other people for whom it was their jobs. I can see, and again, it's humans granting the right to the computer something. So it will be humans handing over something that should be given to humans that is not. Responsibility is what is owed by a person to other persons. So when we say we have rights, if we have rights but no responsibility, then we become tyrants. And we can make computers tyrants if we do that. If you're responsible but have no rights, then you're a slave. And if we make computers do that, they will be slaves, but maybe they should be because they're not human and they are tools, and so we're keeping them as tools without granting them the rights that give them a power that we're just basically giving away other humans positions of having these jobs and all that. Maybe it would be there. So the conversation between rights and responsibilities, we live in a culture that is predominantly going to the defense of rights, but not the defense of responsibility. Somebody else's responsibility to take care of those people. Somebody else needs to, deal with the border and places on the other side of the world. That's not our responsibility, right? So we are highly inclined to shed responsibility and demand rights. Which, if that's what persons become, computers will become tools to try and fulfill the responsibility that we don't want to take up so that we can have our rights met.
yeah,
And
I
in
mean,
both cases, it's a depersonalization in both directions.
right. I mean, what I heard some time ago is that in a court of law, when you give an evidence, like a photo of a person committing a crime, that photo by itself is not enough. You have to have a person saying, I validate this, I
Right.
authenticate it, I stand by that this photo is a depiction of reality.
Yeah.
So there has to be a person validating this image. You cannot just say, oh, here's the image of somebody doing it, there go, they're guilty. And I think the same thing applies to companies and organizations. It is not acceptable for them to say, we didn't know what happened, our program did this, right? That is not acceptable. Like voting machines that a company creates, for example, they have to be responsible for that device. They cannot say, oh, the program is too complicated, we don't know, it just did something, and we're not responsible. No, that cannot be accepted, I
It
think.
has to be validated. Yeah. No, and that
Yeah.
is the maintenance of the personal within it. So to say
Yes.
this book in the first what, 7 chapters, is all about describing a world that has defaulted to something that excludes God, sees everything as physical, questions the mental, and reduces, chapter 6, the inadequacy of nothing but. Everything is reduced merely to the physical and loses the personal that you're talking about there. So the foundation of the argument is, if we don't wake up, we are living in a world where the nature of what is reasonable is something that loses the personal. And even the mental is going to be questioned. And the only way that the mental, in a sense, is given anything that has any validity is kind of your own personal, private way of functioning. So religion is a function of the private that has nothing to do with the world at large. When he transitions to chapter 8 with explanatory frameworks, there is this sense of just asking about the nature of, what is mental activity doing, if not engaging the physical world? And what is the physical world known by us, if not through our mental activity? What is there that we know that our senses haven't given our thinking and remembering kind of ways of thinking to be able to build on? So the integration really of the chapters that follow in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, those are the chapters that are really attempting to say, we have to move out of old paradigms of thinking that separate those things and recognize that they are necessarily implicit in each other. Both need to be fully attended to be able to get something that we could call rational knowledge anyway. So once we do that, we come to this place then where we have other persons. So chapter 11, other minds and the concept of self. Are the thoughts in your head real? I can't see them. Right? Or are they just chemical reactions that are going on there? The Valentine's, every year Valentine's, all that love stuff, that's just chemicals going on. That's the nothing buttery of all of that. So to say that there is something about the possibility of something that we see, the physical human that is there, who has experiences that are able to be communicated, that's your comment of communication, community, dialogue, agreeing on what we mean by these things. So now we're entering into the foundations that he's going to continue through chapters 12, 13, 14, these experiences of the otherness of other persons, the knowing and being known dimensions of what's there. The question in chapter 15 of the unconscious and those things that Freud and Jung particularly put out, that there's this something, the unconscious, which is hard to prove. It's theorized without really grounding it, but it becomes something where Freud, particularly in the idea of the illusion of God, the future of an illusion, is just written off. And so once again, the nature of our thinking self with reference to reality, and particularly the reality of God, is attempted to be excluded. But he's going to build in chapters 16 and 17, somewhat into 18 as well, just talking about the nature of what it means to be personal beings and the personal being and the very being of God, the triune God. With chapter 17, God and God's self and the distinctiveness of persons within the Trinity. In chapter 18, the nature of who Jesus is as somebody who is fully physical, fully mental, and that in really understanding him, he uses the language of mapping on to our understanding of who God is, that maps point us to reality. So Karl Barth's picture of John the Baptist pointing to Jesus, there's a pointing to function. You search the scriptures because you think in them you have life, but they bear witness. That's the mapping onto, they allow you to see and understand the nature of who God is. So this whole concept of the nature of both the physical sciences as well as that engages the world of thought, the mental world, they are all tied up with foundationally that there is a reality, that we have to have an interaction with that reality, and the interaction is both physical and mental, and you can't lose one or the other. or it becomes irrational. So once you have that, then the question of the world of interacting, God come in the person of Jesus Christ, is God interacting with the world in and through scripture, in and through the community of the church, in and through the academy and the nature of what theology has done for us in laying a foundation for understanding the world as God's creation. There is what he describes then as the spiritual domain. And the spiritual domain includes things like love, which is not merely a mental thought or merely a physical thing, though it includes the physical and it includes the mental, the thoughts, the memories, the story of being loved. And so to see that the domain that Jesus particularly brings as, and again, to use Torrance language, not his language, that Jesus is the personalizing person by virtue of being ontologically person of the Trinity, who shows us the other two persons of the Trinity, that in seeing the being of one, we relate to the other, and that the nature of the church itself is a community who brings us to a life of interactedness with the God who speaks, the God who moves and acts and creates. In fact, he creates us as humans, as persons, to love one another. And so the community of love for one another is part of the spiritual domain, the third dimension, he would say, of what a full-bodied scientific world would look like. So we're engaging what it means to be fully human in a world where even the understanding of the world requires that we be humans to know the world. The world doesn't know it's the world by itself. It is we who engage it and act in those kinds of ways. His chapter 19, then, Theology as Science, is to say that theology and science basically echo each other. Both science and theology deal with contingent events. They deal in a world where it's not just given, it's not deterministic. The world is because of particular organizing of the way that that it has come into being. Science and theology deal with an intelligible world. This is Torrance's divine and contingent order. The orderliness of the world is one of the interfaces for us with a world that science engages in it. And guess what? We also engage with it as those who see it as God's world designed in a particular way. And on he goes. I won't list all of them here. But the sixth one, science and theology both deal with relationships. You know, this goes back to the point, Matthew, that you were talking about early on, just the nature of relationality. That, I mean, the hope of the conversation of what Torrance and Bart and others are bringing into play is to see that relativity, as Einstein discovered it, is something that, again, Torrance recognized the social sciences still have not yet achieved the ability to see that relationality is the broader picture within which physicality, i.e. Newton, lives. Newton saw a physical world, described it. So we don't want to throw Newton out, but it's just inadequate to the nature of the whole complex of what reality is. And so he is again building this whole world that relationships are significant. We're always going to be observers, which means we're going to impact. We do have some play within it, and thinking of the uncertainty principle there, the nature of Heisenberg, and the observer changes, impacts what is being observed. But that we're always going to have this interaction with the world. And that science and theology, it's like having one eye. You can't see the depth of what's there because you don't have the dimension. So the whole of what it is that is being brought to bear in the discussion of science and theology ultimately has the capacity to go beyond it. So the final chapter before his summary chapter, Theology Beyond Science. Theology beyond science is saying there is something theology gives us beyond what science could ever give us. And all of our discussion about AI here has, in a sense, been asking this question, you know, what does it look like if science tries to go beyond theology to create something, and Babel and others become appropriate motifs of the human trying to create something other than God to replace God, which is just what we do all the time anyway. But it's becoming more interesting because the new forms that it's taking make it feel like it's something new. But maybe not so much, as the Tower of Babel kind of points out for us. But his first point in theology beyond the science is that the study of the personal goes beyond the impersonal. Science, by definition, is impersonal. I mean, this is why Michael Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge, is such a radical statement. And my dad, who was a scientist, read Personal Knowledge, and he said, I just can't understand it. He taught science at high school level, had a master's degree in mathematics from a Jesuit university, but he couldn't understand Michael Polanyi and that all science is personal, that it is essentially the work of persons, the observation, the recording of what's happening, the reading of those records that people make. All of the work of science is the work of persons engaging the physical world in order to understand it and to share it in communities where we continue to grow in understanding. It's all a personal community. Society of explorers is the term that Polanyi used for that. But most scientists, and I've talked even to psychologists, a psychologist at Regent College who was talking about science and faith, and I said, can you see that in psychology that there's a need to really understand the personal more and not merely the objective? And he couldn't get there because psychology, in order to maintain credibility in the world as a science, needs to make the human phenomenon, particularly disorders, objective. Right. And so even what could be potentially dealing with the personal in psychology and psychiatry, which psychiatry is more the medical curing of what are apparent pathologies, diseases that show up that can be maybe cured that way, but aren't really. Which a woman this week I heard saying, I was working as a psychiatrist, and a person was sent to me for depression. All I had to give him was pills, but what he really needed was a home. He was homeless. It was a systemic problem pills could never solve. And it's like, wow, that is insightful. And so, in a sense, this theology beyond science, theology has the capacity to see persons as persons, to see them as God has made them, and to see the world as a place within which we care for one another as God has made us. And that theology then points us to a system of thinking and acting and living out of the love of God that becomes redemptive and caring of one another in the world in a way that is the echo of the Bible. It is the Bible being preached not just in the pulpit, but in the streets and in our homes. I mean, that is in a sense the third of parts. The word, the living word, the written word, and the word preached is best not just preached from the pulpit, but it's really preached in how we live our life, hearing the living word through the written word, and then by the Spirit, living that out in every day, in our occurrences everywhere. So the whole nature then of where this book leaves us is to say, it's not just that we're equal with or just collaborate sometimes with science, it's that theology actually has something that goes beyond what it would look like for science to do the best that it could do. And it is the realm of the personal. And it is essential. And if we don't get that, there is a kind of a slide of humanity because of fear, because of control, competition, all these things that we are going into highly self-destructive and other destructive modes of being. And theology, i.e. the God who is the God of reconciliation and redemption, we need that. We need that God to lead us because we can't do it in and of ourselves. My stepson is doing an MBA at University of Washington. And he talked about the class that he was taking. They're talking about blue ocean thinking. And I said, what's that? And he says, well, red ocean thinking is where everybody is competing with one another. There's just blood everywhere. And he says, in many cases, in businesses, in politics, even in churches, it's all red blood thinking. We're competing with other people and we just have to outcompete them. We have to appear better than them and all that. But he said, blue ocean thinking is where you recognize something that nobody else has thought of that provides answers that need to be there. So at some level, in its early phases at least, Amazon provided a way for you to get books that could come from around the world, push a button and it shows up on your door in a day or two. That was thinking, what is the need and how do we meet it in a way that nobody else is doing? Of course, people come along then and become competitors and the ocean turns red, right? And I was just thinking, the church should be never red. It's never competition. It's always collaboration. It's always communication. It's always connection. It's always building something so that there is an environment where the love of God, the spiritual, what he would call here the spiritual domain, dominates our thinking, and that there's always a sense of the value of each particular part, but the need to recognize the integratedness of our lives as God has made us in this created world. And that in thinking out of that center that can only be there on God, we get something that maintains the blue sea thinking or blue ocean thinking, which is where I think he leaves us, seeing the world holistically versus fragmented. A fragmented world is going to be a world where people are trying to see how each thing is going to affect them. And so they take the world apart and they deal with the threats, the things that might give them pleasure for a time. They'll work towards those. So the vacation, whatever material things they think will make them happy, that's all part of a fragmented world. So I find this book as the culmination of the whole series to be one that is really trying to bring together, in a sense, all of it. In a sense, it's the most Torrance-like sounding of the books, though they all definitely echo Torrance. But it is this: we need to listen to science and theology. We need to take both of them more seriously. We need to have people who can, if you choose one or the other, science or theology, it's going to be something that doesn't engage reality. And so there's a sense for the church today, particularly, to be, in a sense, leaders in really thinking about what does it look like to not have theology just be something we give in our churches for people to get information, doctrinal statements, and all those things, but that it really is the aligning of our being with the God who speaks to us, loves us, and calls us to live within that love in a day-by-day way of being, and to believe that the Spirit is actually present in there. If you don't believe the Spirit is actually there, I was just thinking, if somebody says to you, I don't believe my wife loves me, it's like, well, we need to start by you believing your wife loves you and figure out how she's trying to communicate it, because she probably does. But if you don't believe it, guess what? You'll never understand. And this is, I must believe and understand, or faith-seeking understanding. If you have no faith your spouse loves you, you will never understand how they do. But if you have faith that they must, but you don't understand, now you are set to learn the nature of what's going on, and maybe together to learn what it looks like to work that faith out. And so theology and science, I think, are in that kind of place. We need to learn, respect, have faith that the other has goodwill, and then engage in the process of coming to, out of that understanding, to have lives and understandings that engage. Todd says, I think we need to pool resources by Matt and 911 to prove things can never be spiritual contentment, to bring spiritual contentment. Todd, do you want to comment on that? We can start that pool today if you throw in your first $100 for us.
Yeah, maybe Mac. Yeah, I'm just thinking of 9/11, and then we could prove that, as you say, that things are not going to bring spiritual happiness.
Right. The thing with proving is tricky, isn't it? Whenever you put prove in, you make the human the judge. Oh, that's the problem. That's why apologetics are so problematic, is that in the end, when you prove God, a person decides that they have enough proof, but all they've done is set themselves as the reasonable judge of all things. And we're back in the very step one of where this book begins, with the problem of the human at the center, with the limitation on thinking and physical world without the dimension of God and who God is being the determination of what is real for us. But thank you for your contribution, Todd. but
bet.
we might be able to get that for you. So a couple of things as we wrap up here. Next week we will we'll have go back to the ground and grammar of theology with Travis Stevick. So we'll be in chapter 4. We actually will have chapter 3 with Perry Magruder the third week, I think it is, in January, because he wasn't able to do it in December. So we're a little bit out of order, but hopefully that'll begin. His is the chapter on natural theology. In 2024, there was another series that T.F. Torrance edited. There were 5 books in that series. And so we will also look at that edited series when we get a little bit further on into 2024. In January, we will also have Paul Metzger with his new book on personalistic ethics. He'll be with us the second week in January. So anyway, we have all kinds of exciting things coming up. I see that hand, Young-il.
Just one administrative thing. The link on on your page on the TF Torrance website does not work. It's not the same as the link that you have on Facebook. So
Yes. Okay, I'll
I
have
was
Carrie change that. Thank you for pointing that out.
okay.
Carrie manages that part of the page. So I will ask him to change that. Thank you for
Okay.
that.
Yeah. That's why
Young, where are you based?
the
And what do you do?
San Francisco Bay Area, and I've been involved in doing software development, but my background is in math and in computer science.
Very good.
But
And how did you meet Torrance?
Oh, that's a long story. I somehow found out about him when I was in grad school, and I actually went to one of his talks that he gave at Fuller Seminary,
Wow.
one of the Peyton lectures, and I was just blown away by his his presentation, because I had a hard time understanding other theologians like Thielicke and so on. And
Yes.
they're just filled with jargon. But when I heard him speak, he spoke like a scientist. He was clear in what he was saying and so on. And so after that, I just read everything I could get my hands on him.
Wonderful.
And yeah. And Marty, I also appreciate your comment about Polanyi. I think I encountered him too in grad school, and I read his whole personal knowledge.
Yeah.
It's like in a week or two, and I just devoured it.
Yes.
And then when I recommended it to some other faculty, I mean, some pastor, they said they could not get into it. And I think part of it is you have to have a certain amount of scientific background to understand what Polanyi is trying to get at. But also it's because modern view of science is a caricature of how science is really done.
Yes.
And so people think science is objective, that you go from, and mathematics is objective. Whereas what Polanyi is saying is that no, in real science, you have faith. You believe something is true, and then you try and prove it because there's some intuition, the tacit dimension and all that. And so I think that's.
Yeah. And the word personal is perfect there. It's neither completely objective in the object nor subjective just in my thinking. It is the meeting of the thinking subject with the objective world, and that is the personal.
That's right. Polanyi says what you're doing is you are proposing something that you believe is true, but that others will also agree is true.
They can enter into that. Yeah.
That's right. You're not just being arbitrary, but you believe others will all agree with you. That because it is more real, right? That's the definition of objectivity. Is that many agree to it. Yeah.
I fight for the word personal there. That personal is fully objective and it's fully subjective, meeting in that place where it can't collapse into one or the other.
Yes.
Right.
That's right. I agree with you.
Yeah. Good. Well, I will see you next week, and we'll get this posted for others that weren't able to be with us today. But I think this was a very interesting engagement with this text that went all over the place, as it should. Fireworks, the grand fireworks to end the year, with a conversation ranging into many different fields of thought. and the future and the past and all that. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Excellent as always, Marty.
Very good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And blessings, and we'll see you next year.